It's funny. You look at the business landscape these days, and it seems like so many companies are international right out of the gate.
Yeah, yeah.
You think EasyJet.
Uh-huh.
They're like, boom, revolutionizing European travel from the get-go.
Mm-hmm.
Or Logitech. Their tech's hitting shelves all over the world almost immediately.
Yeah.
And Skype, connecting people across borders right from the start. They're just born global.
Yeah, and it's not even just the big names anymore, right? You're seeing more and more small and medium-sized businesses. They're making international operations just a core part of their strategy right from day one.
Right, like built into their DNA. It's so interesting because it's like flipping the traditional script.
Mm-hmm.
We're so used to seeing businesses conquer their home market, and then maybe they think, okay, now we can expand internationally.
Right, totally. I mean, that's the traditional model. But what's so fascinating about this shift is that we're seeing this rise of, they call them born global firms or international new ventures.
Catchy names.
Yeah, right. And it's basically these businesses that are intentionally designed for that international stage right from the start, or at least very, very near to their launch. And the core insight, I think, here is that born global success really hinges on having this early and acute global lens. It's seeing opportunities not just as extensions of what you're doing domestically, but as inherently cross-border resource combinations from the get-go.
Okay, so to put this into perspective, like building any startup, it's a roller coaster, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're taking risks, things are uncertain.
Sure.
But with these international new ventures, it's like they're strapping in for a ride with extra loops and twists.
Right, yeah. Way more moving parts.
So much more complexity, so much more uncertainty. It really makes you wonder about the entrepreneurs behind them and what capabilities, like what special skills and instincts they bring to the table. It feels like a really important area to explore, to understand what makes them tick.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's exactly what we're going to try and unpack in this deep dive, really focusing on, what are those essential entrepreneurial capabilities?
Yeah. That drive the success of these international new ventures. And when we say capabilities, we're thinking those specific global business instincts and skills that you need right from day one.
Yeah, like the Global Founders Toolkit.
Exactly. And our exploration for this deep dive is going to be grounded in some academic research, some really, really insightful work.
And it's focused on this one Turkish entrepreneur, right?
Yes.
Who managed to launch not just one successful international company, but two.
Yeah, it's an incredible story.
First, there was Jenny back in 1992, followed by Neroli in 1999.
Yep.
And by the time the researchers finished their study, Neroli had this truly global presence, over 88 stores across 9 countries, mostly in Eastern Europe.
Right.
They had design and supplier relationships over in Italy, and then their manufacturing base was back in Turkey.
Wow.
Employing over 750 people.
Yeah, very impressive. And what makes this particular case study so insightful is that both of these ventures, both Jenny and Neroli, they were international from their very inception.
I mean, their business models were fundamentally built around strategically tapping into resources in different countries right from the get-go. And on top of that, the entrepreneur himself, he had limited financial backing when he started. So it really highlights how crucial his inherent abilities and capabilities were in driving the impressive growth of both of these companies.
It really emphasizes that the person, the entrepreneur, is so central to the story. And you've used this term entrepreneurial capabilities a couple of times. Just so we're all on the same page, can we unpack that a bit?
Sure. When we talk about entrepreneurial capabilities, we're really talking about those essential global business instincts and skills that are needed from day one. And these skills, they go beyond what you might need for a typical startup. These are specifically for navigating the complexities of international business. So things like cultural awareness, global market knowledge, a knack for connecting resources across borders, all of that comes into play.
So it's about having a founder's mindset that's inherently global. Now, when we use the term international entrepreneurship in this context, it's important to be precise because we're not simply talking about a company that dips its toes into, say, exporting or importing a few things.
Right, exactly. We're talking about a much more deliberate, much more strategic approach.
So can you kind of paint a picture for us? What's the bigger picture here?
Yeah, so in the bigger picture, international entrepreneurship is really about building a competitive advantage through these complex international resource configurations. So it's about strategically sourcing, manufacturing, distributing, marketing, all while navigating different cultural and regulatory landscapes. Think about a company like Dell, right? They initially focused very heavily on the US market. or Zora, they built this really strong foundation in Spain before they ever really ventured out internationally. These are examples of businesses that kind of internationalized after achieving that initial domestic success. What we're focused on today are the ventures that are thinking and acting globally right from the start.
Okay, so they're not waiting to go global, they're starting global.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so interesting and challenging.
So to guide our deep dive, we've got three core questions from the research that we're going to try and answer. First, what are the entrepreneurial capabilities that are absolutely mission critical for a new venture to be able to scale internationally so rapidly? Second, where do these capabilities even come from?
Hmm.
And finally, how can entrepreneurs actively cultivate and develop these necessary skills? Like, if this is the Global Founders Toolkit, how do you get your hands on those tools in the first place?
Right. These are really fundamental questions when we're trying to understand the unique dynamics of building a born global firm. And to really appreciate the context of our entrepreneur's journey, the one we're talking about today, we need to take a quick detour back in time.
Okay.
To 1989 in particular, there are two key historical events that really shaped the landscape in which our entrepreneurs' ventures were born.
Okay, so set the stage for us. What were these pivotal moments in history?
So the first one, and this was incredibly disruptive, was the forced emigration of over 360,000 Bulgarians of Turkish ethnicity to Turkey. And this all happened between June and August of 1989. It was really the result of a very, very intense, very oppressive assimilation process that had been going on in Bulgaria,
Wow.
which basically involved forcibly changing the names of Turkish and other ethnic minorities, suppressing their religious practices. So you can imagine these people, they often arrived in Turkey with very little in terms of possessions, and they faced this immense challenge of rebuilding their lives.
Yeah, that's a staggering human impact, to
Yeah.
be uprooted from your home, from your life. And what about the second key historical factor? How did that play into this evolving story of international entrepreneurship?
Well, the second one was the fall of the Berlin Wall in November of 1989.
Okay, yeah.
And this event, it really set off a chain reaction across Eastern Europe, leading to the transition of all of these Soviet bloc countries from, very rigid, centrally planned economies
Right.
to market-based systems with multi-party democracies. So almost overnight, these entirely new entrepreneurial opportunities just started emerging.
Wow, so you've got these two seemingly separate events, this forced migration and then the collapse of the Soviet system. And it's almost like they collided in a way that ignited this wave of entrepreneurial energy.
It's fascinating how they intersect.
So how did that actually play out in terms of, fueling entrepreneurship?
Well, what we saw was this significant surge in what were called luggage traders. These were individuals, often from the newly opening countries of the former Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe, and they would travel to neighboring countries, primarily Turkey, actually, to purchase goods
Uh,
like clothing, textiles, leather products, you name it, they were buying it.
okay.
And then they would take these goods back to their home countries to sell in their local markets
Mm.
because there was this huge pent-up demand for Western-style consumer goods. It really symbolized this new era of perceived affluence and access.
So it's almost like this informal grassroots trade network that's sprung up organically, driven by the changing political and economic landscape. And Turkey became this unexpected hub for all this activity.
Absolutely. In fact, by 1998, this largely informal trade was estimated to be worth around 8.8 billion US dollars,
Wow.
which, to put that into perspective, is a pretty significant chunk compared to Turkey's total official exports at the time, which were in the range of, 20 to 30 billion annually.
It's like a whole shadow economy running parallel to the official one. So much opportunity, so much energy. And this is where our entrepreneur, Ismail Karov, steps onto the stage, right?
Exactly. Ismail Karov, he was one of those hundreds of thousands of Bulgarians of Turkish ethnicity who were forced to emigrate to Turkey back in 1989.
Okay.
But, he quickly encountered a major hurdle.
Yep.
His education and his extensive industrial experience, which he'd acquired in Bulgaria, weren't recognized in Turkey.
Ah, so it's like starting over from scratch.
Basically, yeah. He really struggled to find any kind of meaningful employment and became deeply frustrated by the limited opportunities that were available to new immigrants like himself.
Yeah, it's tough to imagine. Your skills, your experience, all those years of hard work, it's almost like they're suddenly erased.
Hmm.
So how did he respond to this really difficult situation?
Well, he really reflected on his circumstances, and this quote from him really captures his mindset. He said, "The salary I received was barely enough, even though I worked as many shifts as possible. I realized that if I remained as an employee in any factory, in any position, I would never be able to put my kids through good schools, provide them with good lifestyles.
Yeah.
I had no other option but to go back to Bulgaria and sell the house in order to create something, have my own business, do something on my own.
So it was that drive to build something for himself, to create a better future for his family that really pushed him forward. And he actually decided to go back to Bulgaria. That seems counterintuitive considering the circumstances.
It does, doesn't it? But he did. He went back and sold whatever assets he had left there and used that to generate the initial capital he needed to start a business. But instead of just settling in Turkey and trying to make a go of it there, he decided to embark on this sort of fact-finding mission. He traveled across the newly democratized Eastern Europe and Russia and really tried to understand the market potential in these rapidly changing economies.
So it's like he's a pioneer scouting out this new frontier of opportunity.
Yeah, very much so. And through this, firsthand experience, he pretty quickly identified Russia as the most promising market for his future ventures.
What was it about Russia that stood out to him? What made it more attractive than, say, some of the other former Soviet republics?
Well, there were a few key things. First, having grown up in communist Bulgaria, he had a certain level of cultural familiarity with Russia.
Right, right.
And he even had some basic Russian language skills.
Okay.
Second, the sheer size of the Russian market was obviously a big draw.
Yeah, that's hard to ignore.
And finally, based on his initial observations, he felt that Russian consumers were relatively sophisticated in their tastes and aspirations,
Interesting.
which suggested that there was a market there for quality goods. They weren't just looking for the cheapest thing. They wanted things that had style, that had a certain level of sophistication.
So he saw potential, but he needed to figure out exactly what that potential translated into in terms of a business. So how did that initial insight in Russia about the market, about the consumers, how did that lead him to create his first business venture, Jenny?
Okay, so as Karov was traveling through Russia and Eastern Europe, he noticed something really interesting. He observed that there was a very noticeable lack of affordable yet stylish leather accessories for women.
Really, like handbags, purses, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And this was a pretty significant unmet need in the market.
Mm-hmm.
So when he returned to Istanbul, he was thinking about this. He wanted to capitalize on that demand in Russia, but he also wanted to tap into that burgeoning network of Russian luggage traders who were constantly coming to Istanbul to source goods.
Right, those entrepreneurs you talked about earlier who were buying up all sorts of things to sell back home.
Exactly. And he knew that leather goods were popular, so he thought, why not create a company that specifically caters to this market? And that's really how Jenny was born. He reached out to an acquaintance who owned a leather manufacturing facility in Istanbul, and they agreed to partner and launch this new company together.
So it was really a strategic partnership from the very beginning. What was the core idea behind Jenny? What were they producing?
The core idea was to manufacture high-quality leather products and accessories specifically for this growing segment of entrepreneurs from Russia and Eastern Europe. They were making things like handbags, wallets, belts, the kinds of things that were in high demand back in Russia.
Okay. And what was Karov's role in the partnership?
Well, in this initial venture, he actually held a minority equity stake. His partner contributed the majority of the initial financial investment and the production capabilities.
Okay, so he's leveraging his knowledge of the market, his connection.
Exactly. He's the one who really understands the Russian market and the needs of those luggage traders.
So how did Janet perform in those early days? Was it an immediate success?
It was, actually. Genian experienced really strong demand almost immediately.
Wow.
Their leather goods were a hit. But as the company gained traction and became more and more successful, Karov started to think long-term.
Okay.
He realized that to really secure long-term growth or build strong brand recognition, they needed to evolve beyond just selling to these open-air market vendors.
So he wanted to move beyond those initial, almost informal channels.
Exactly. He wanted to get his products into more established retail channels, into actual shops.
It's like professionalizing the distribution and moving up the value chain.
Yeah.
So what did he do to achieve that?
Well, he made a strategic shift in his distribution approach. He started appointing one primary distributor, often one of his existing reliable, high-volume retailers, in each of the key cities where he was operating. And this move, it actually had a really positive ripple effect. Consumers responded favorably, the distributors themselves were happy with the arrangement, and it started to establish the Jenny brand in the minds of Russian retailers.
That's smart. It gives him more control over how his products are presented, how they reach the customer.
Exactly.
So Jenny sounds like a pretty solid success story. What led him to depart from Jenny's and establish his second company, Neroli? Was it just a desire to do his own thing, or was there more to it?
It's a good question. So, while Jenny had become this well-recognized and profitable brand in Russia, Karov started to have some disagreements with his partner
Oh,
about the strategic direction of the company, where they should go next, how they should grow. And these differences ultimately proved irreconcilable, and he made the decision to leave Jenny and start his own new international leather accessories venture.
so he's taking the valuable lessons he's learned from building Jenny and starting with a clean slate, with his own vision.
Exactly. But this time around, he had this incredible advantage because he could strategically leverage all the knowledge and all the networks that he had built up during his time at Genia. He still had his deep understanding of the Turkish leather manufacturing industry, but he also started sourcing raw materials and design inspiration from Italy, which allowed him to offer a higher level of quality and style.
Okay.
And perhaps even more importantly, he was able to tap directly into that network of trusted Russian distributors that he had so painstakingly built while he was at Jenny.
So he's not starting from zero, he's building on his past successes.
Exactly. This combination, the high-quality materials, the Italian design, and that established distribution network, it meant that Neroli could offer products that really stood out in the market. They were fashionable, they were well-made, and they were priced competitively.
And that pre-existing network in Russia, that gave Neroli a significant head start in entering international markets, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he already had this built-in network of loyal retailers in Russia and the surrounding former Soviet republics.
So they're ready and waiting to stock his new products.
Exactly. They knew him, they trusted him, and they were eager to work with him again. So naturally, Neroli's initial focus was on these regions where he had those strong pre-existing connections. It was a very strategic way to launch and to grow quickly.
It's like hitting the ground running.
Right.
And ultimately, Neroli achieved even greater success and broader reach than Jenny's, right?
That's right. I mean, by the time this research was done, Neroli's international operations involved about 750 people, and they were doing everything from design and production to distribution and retail. Their products were available in 77 stores across 9 countries, and they'd actually expanded beyond Russia and the former Soviet republics. They were in North America, they were in the Middle East.
Wow.
And what's really interesting is that they significantly outperformed Jenny across a whole range of metrics, overall sales volume, the size of their distribution network, product design, innovation, quality, and of course, profitability.
So, the story of Jenny, and then the even greater success of Neroli, combined with Karov's own evolution as an entrepreneur, it gives us this really rich case study for understanding what it really takes to create and thrive as an international new venture.
Exactly. It's all about understanding those core capabilities. And that brings us to the heart of our discussion today, which is those essential entrepreneurial capabilities that seem to be so crucial for success in these kinds of ventures.
Okay, so can we just take a moment to define exactly what we mean by entrepreneurial capabilities in this context?
Sure. So entrepreneurial capabilities, broadly speaking, are those abilities and skills that allow an individual or a team to not only identify new and potentially lucrative opportunities, but to also effectively build up and manage all the necessary resources.
Financial, human, technological.
Exactly, all of it, in order to actually exploit those opportunities and build a sustainable business. But of course, we're focusing on the international dimension here.
Right. So how does this apply to someone who's building a business that's inherently global from the start?
So in an international context, these capabilities become even more important because you're dealing with a whole extra layer of complexity. You're navigating different cultures, different legal systems, different market dynamics.
So those more general entrepreneurial traits we often hear about, things like having a good sense for a business opportunity or being really resourceful, do those still hold true in this international context?
Absolutely. I mean, those general competencies are still very important. But what we're focusing on today are 3 specific capabilities that this research really highlights as being uniquely critical for the success of international new ventures. And these were particularly evident in Karov's journey. So those 3 are international opportunity identification, institutional bridging, and then a preference and capacity for cross-cultural collaboration.
Okay, those sound important. Let's break them down. So first up, we've got international opportunity identification. How is this different from simply recognizing a good business opportunity within your own domestic market? What makes it international?
So, in general, entrepreneurs, they identify opportunities in a few ways. They might actively search the market for unmet needs or new trends. They might stumble upon opportunities just through their existing experiences and networks.
Hmm.
Or they might have this like creative spark and they come up with an entirely new idea combining resources in a novel way. And in Koroff's case, it was that creative combination of resources, but specifically across borders, that was so important.
So it's like connecting the dots, but on a global scale.
Exactly. So while all successful entrepreneurs need that ability to recognize a promising opportunity, in an international context, this process gets way more complex.
Hmm.
Because the opportunity often lies across those national borders.
Right.
And that requires international awareness, cross-cultural understanding, and knowledge of global markets, things that you wouldn't necessarily need for a purely domestic venture.
In Korolov's experience in Russia, seeing those women carrying plastic bags, it seems like a perfect example of this international opportunity identification in action.
Oh, it's a classic example. So initially, when Parov was exploring the Russian market, he was actually looking for fairly straightforward export opportunities.
Okay.
He was even considering exporting construction marble from Russia back to Turkey. But then, during one of his trips, he just happened to notice something, it was almost accidental, a real case of fortuitous discovery.
And that was the observation about the lack of affordable, stylish bags for women.
Exactly. He saw these stylish women in Moscow, and they were carrying their things in plastic bags.
Plastic bags.
Yeah, not because they wanted to, but because there simply weren't any good alternatives available.
Okay.
And he was struck by that. He even said, I saw many stylish women on the streets of Moscow carrying their belongings in plastic bags.
Wow.
Not that they wanted to do that, he said, but because they had no option. There were no purses or bags available at that time.
So he saw a need that nobody else was really meeting.
Exactly. I saw an opportunity in the market, he said, and I acted on it. And it wasn't just about seeing the need. It was about connecting that need in Russia with the capabilities he knew existed back in Turkey.
Right. That's the international opportunity identification piece. He's not just seeing a problem, he's seeing a way to solve it by linking resources across borders.
Exactly. He realized that Turkish leather manufacturing was high quality and relatively cost-effective. And that insight, combined with his understanding of the Russian market, it led him to create Genis. And then later, his recognition that there was a market for even higher quality, more fashionable leather goods, that's what led to the creation of Neroli.
Okay, so it's about seeing those connections, but it's also about understanding the cultural context.
Yeah.
Making sure that what you're offering is actually going to resonate in that new market. So how can an entrepreneur develop this international opportunity identification muscle?
That's a good question. While creativity is a bit of a mystery, it's hard to teach that. The research really emphasizes the importance of building international knowledge. And you can do this in a few ways. Maximize information gathering from diverse sources. But most importantly, get out there and experience different markets firsthand. That learning by doing, that direct interaction, that's invaluable.
Right. It's not enough to just read about it. You got to immerse yourself in it.
Exactly. And networking is crucial. Building relationships with people who have international experience, finding mentors who've been there and done that.
So it's like building your own global advisory board in a way.
In a sense, yeah. And some scholars even talk about opportunity development instead of just opportunity recognition, emphasizing that you're not just passively waiting for an opportunity to appear, you're actively shaping and pursuing it.
It's taking ownership of that process.
Exactly. And a good example of this is David Van Reynen, the founder of Earthport.
Okay.
He saw this huge opportunity in online international payments when e-commerce was starting to take off globally.
Mm-hmm.
And his key insight was that people were often hesitant to make cross-border payments electronically. There were trust issues. It felt complex.
Yeah.
So he created this whole global network of banking relationships to make those transactions smoother and more trustworthy.
It's like he identified this global friction point and then built a cross-border solution to address it.
Exactly. That's international opportunity identification at its finest.
Okay, let's move on to the second entrepreneurial capability. Institutional bridging. What is that exactly, and how does it come to play for international new ventures?
Okay, so institutional bridging, it's all about navigating those differences in business environments that exist between countries.
Yeah.
And we call those differences institutional distance.
Institutional distance. Okay.
And this can include things like legal and regulatory systems, cultural norms, political structures, how developed the economy is. All those things can be vastly different from one country to another.
And the greater that distance, the harder it is to do business.
Exactly. And the riskier it can feel. So institutional bridging is about being able to translate your business concept, your strategies, your opportunities across these different institutional contexts.
So it's about taking something that works in one market and figuring out how to make it work in a completely different one.
Exactly. And Karov's decision to establish a chain of menswear stores in Russia, that's a great example of this.
Okay, tell me about that. How does that illustrate institutional bridging?
Well, he noticed that while there were a lot of Western brands entering Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, there weren't any established chain stores specifically for men's clothing,
Interesting.
catering to that mid to high income male consumer.
So he saw a gap in the market.
Yes, and he knew a Turkish company called Serar, a large menswear manufacturer,
Uh-huh.
but they were primarily focused on the domestic Turkish market.
Okay.
So he partnered with them, and they created these Neroli branded retail stores in Russia. They sold both Neroli accessories and Sarar clothing, and it became Russia's first nationwide chain of menswear stores. And since then, it's expanded into other former Soviet republics like Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan.
Wow, that's really smart. He's bridging the gap between Turkish manufacturing capabilities and this unmet need in the Russian market.
And he was able to do that so effectively, partly because of his own unique background.
Right, his Turkish-Bulgarian heritage.
Exactly. He was fluent in Russian. He understood the cultural and economic shifts happening in the former Soviet bloc. He also understood Turkish business practices. And both Turkish and Eastern European cultures place a strong emphasis on personal relationships and trust in business. So he was almost a natural fit for bridging these two worlds.
So what are the essential ingredients, the key things that you need to be good at institutional bridging?
The research identifies three core components. First, you need a deep, detailed understanding of the social and cultural nuances of your target market.
Okay.
So that's knowing how customers behave, what the cultural norms are, and how to navigate the legal and regulatory environment.
Right, you need to be culturally fluent.
Exactly. Second, you need to develop strong networks with key actors in that market.
So finding the right local partners, building relationships.
Exactly. For Karov, it was mostly about finding those local distributors. But it could also involve alliances with established local firms.
Okay, so that's two. What's the third component?
The third component is about human capital.
People.
Yeah, it's being able to attract and retain talented local employees
Okay.
and adapting your management style to fit the local context. This can be tricky when the institutional distance is really large because it might mean adjusting your entire business model.
So you need to be adaptable, flexible, willing to learn and adjust.
Definitely. And a good example of this is Stelios Hadji Ioannou, the founder of EasyJet.
Okay.
He took the low-cost airline model that Southwest Airlines had made so successful in the U.S. and adapted it for Europe.
Makes sense.
And even though the U.S. and Western Europe might seem relatively similar, he still had to navigate all these different regulations, labor laws, and consumer protection rules across all those different European countries.
Right. So even when the distance seems small, there are still those institutional hurdles to overcome. Okay, let's move on to the third key entrepreneurial capability, the preference and capacity for cross-cultural collaboration. Can you unpack that for us a bit?
Sure. So this one's all about building strong relationships across different cultures and really embedding that collaboration into your entire value chain.
So it's not just about finding a supplier in a different country, it's about having a deeper, more collaborative relationship with them.
Exactly. And Karov was a master at this. His collaborations with Italian suppliers, Turkish manufacturers, and those Russian distributors, it was a huge advantage for both Jenny and Neroli. And he consistently chose collaboration over trying to do everything in-house or just having transactional relationships.
So he's building a global network of partners, people he can trust and rely on.
Exactly. And his approach to building his distribution network in Russia, that really highlights this capability. Instead of opening his own stores, he actively sought out local partners to act as distributors. And he was really good at identifying the right partners and building those relationships based on trust.
So how did he build that trust? I mean, especially when you're dealing with different cultures, different languages, it must have been challenging.
He went above and beyond to demonstrate that he was trustworthy. For example, he allowed his distributors to pay for goods after they had sold them.
Wow.
which is pretty uncommon.
Yeah.
But it showed them that he had confidence in his products and their ability to sell them.
Right. And it removed a lot of the risk for them.
Exactly. It built trust, it created a sense of mutual benefit, and it fostered loyalty.
And you also cultivated those personal relationships,
Oh,
though.
absolutely. He would
Yeah.
go to their birthdays, their weddings, even vacations. He had this sign in his office that said, "Please come in for a cup of homeland coffee." And it was written in Russian, Bulgarian, and Turkish.
Wow.
It was all about creating this sense of shared identity, of camaraderie. And it worked. Within 6 months, he had formal distribution agreements with 15 different Russian traders across all these different cities.
That's incredible.
Mhm.
So what are the essential elements of successful cross-cultural collaboration?
The research points to two key components. First, you need to be able to identify and select the right partners.
People who share your values, your vision.
Exactly. And Karov was great at articulating his vision. He got people excited about working with him.
Okay.
And one of his Russian distributors actually said, "We invest almost everything we have for this business.
Wow.
It is our way to upgrade, become successful, and bring some bread to our family. We know that if we cheat, there is no coming back."
They're all in.
Yeah, that's real trust.
Yeah.
And the second component is about establishing the systems and processes for effective coordination and integration across all these different partnerships.
Okay, so it's not enough to just have good relationships. You need to have the infrastructure in place to make it all work smoothly.
Exactly. You've got to deal with different languages, time zones, all those unspoken cultural differences.
Right.
For example, Neroli would send people to trade fairs in Italy to keep up with the latest design trends.
Oh.
Then they'd create prototypes in Turkey. And then they'd do market testing in Russia and Eastern Europe. It was this really integrated cross-cultural feedback loop.
So they're constantly gathering.